Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. To respond to the corruption and violence that have long plagued Rikers Island, Mayor de Blasio has proposed an increase of $54 million to the 2016 preliminary budget for the Department of Corrections. But Martin Horn, a former Commissioner of Corrections and now distinguished lecturer at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and my guest today, says that's not the whole answer. Why not? Welcome. Why not? I know you're not objecting to the money part.
Well, the money's a down payment, and it's a good start. But it's only part of the story. Ronnie, as you know, the issues of the city's jails go back at least to the 1970s. They go back 50 years. The litigation in the Benjamin case dates to the early 70s, and those issues haven't been resolved.
What was that issue?
Well, the issue there was the entirety of the conditions of confinement in the city jails, the jails on Rikers Island as well as the jails in the boroughs. And really, the issue is the way the city has approached jailing, both leading up to that and since then. A large part of the problem has been the attitude that the city takes towards its own children, because after all, who's in our jails but the city's children? And we reject them, and we send them away. And that has enormous symbolic value. When you were in city government, when I started my career, the city had jails in Brooklyn, the city had jails in the Bronx, the city had jails in Manhattan, in Queens. Today, many of those jails are closed or gone or unused. Those jails were part of the community. The families had access. The lawyers who represented their clients had access. Clergy had access. Over the years, especially in the 70s and 80s and 90s, as we went through waves of crime and increasing incarceration, and the city's jail population grew, the city more and more came to rely on Rikers Island. It built buildings on Rikers Island that are architecturally poorly designed and in some cases unsound, and that make good therapeutic corrections difficult to achieve.
Let's describe Rikers Island. It's an island.
It's an island. It's 437 acres.
And it started in the 1800s.
Yes.
But 1933 or somewhere around then is when the first
Yes.
new building was built?
Yes, during the Jimmy Walker administration. In New York State, when you are sentenced for a misdemeanor or some lower class felonies, you can receive a sentence of up to 1 year, which under New York law, you serve in your local county jail, which the New York City Department of Correction is for the 5 counties. And so the city built a penitentiary for sentenced prisoners. And it worked much like a prison works. It had a farm, they raised chickens. I'm told they had a furniture factory, they had a bakery, they had a laundry, and it made sense. These are people who were serving long periods of time. Their sentence were concluded. They were no longer awaiting trial. And that made some sense. And at some point, also in the 30s, they built a small hospital adjacent to the main penitentiary, and that made sense, a centralized hospital for the prisoners. But they continued to rely on the Raymond Street Jail and on the Brooklyn House of Detention and on the Tombs and the Queens House and the Bronx House on River Avenue. But as the population grew, as you know, they closed the Women's House of Detention on Greenwich Avenue. And it's now an open park, lovely park, but they built a new jail for women, the Rose M. Singer Center on Rikers Island, which, well, perhaps it was modern at the time, was really for the children of the women who were confined there, for their family members, a very difficult place to get to. To get to Rikers Island from parts of East New York and Far Rockaway is a 4-hour round trip.
And just to get there, even from Manhattan, it just takes forever.
Takes forever. And it's a very isolating place. And then gradually the city more and more came to rely on Rikers Island, and that creates a culture. First of all, it sends a message that these are, the people in jail are other. They are other than ourselves, and it demonizes them and it stigmatizes them. Even, the place is in a body of water that's referred to as Bowery Bay. The one bridge to go over it. You've been there. On one side is a wastewater treatment plant, and on the other side is the fuel depot for LaGuardia Airport.
And overhead are the
airplanes. And I've always felt dumping gasoline residue. And there are people, the union at one point felt that it was carcinogenic to work there. And it may well be. I don't think that that's been determined once and for all.
So it would be to be there also.
Yeah, right. I felt that way.
Yeah.
Every day I worked there, I felt that I was covered with a greasy film. And so it sends a message. And the staff gets that message. The staff ultimately feels ghettoized. And they feel that they take the message away that the city doesn't really care about the people who are out there, because look at the way we treat them. The buildings are dismal. You've been in them. They're low ceiling. They lack good light,
noisy.
Natural light. They are noisy. The fixtures with which they are constructed are not of this quality that you find in well-built prisons. There's an article in the New York Times today about the debate in the American Institute of Architects about prison architecture. And well-built prisons are very different from the jails on Rikers Island.
It's almost as if we've exiled this part of the population.
This is our Devil's Island.
And we don't want to hear from you.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Right, and it comes also from a total lack of compassion, it seems to me, on the part of the public. I don't quite understand that.
Yes, it represents that. The Brooklyn House of Detention, which was built in 1957, certainly its presence did not stop Brooklyn Heights and Cobble Hill and Boerum Hill from thriving. The zoning envelope for that parcel of land would allow a building that could house twice as many prisoners, which would make it very cost effective and would enable us to bring 1,600 prisoners from Rikers Island closer to their homes in Brooklyn, people who are on trial. In 2004 and 5, I tried to double the size of the Brooklyn House of Detention and ran into tremendous opposition from the community, who I think were demonizing the prisoners and their families. You know, the prisoners don't get out. It's the families who come to visit, who line up on the street, who they see with their shopping bags of packages. And I think that's very sad.
And let's go back now to the jail, because it's not a prison. People are there supposedly for a year. They've either had their cases heard and been sentenced and waiting to go to prison.
Well, let's get away from the year. Most of the building, Rikers Island is not a jail. People refer to the jail.
How many jails?
There are 10 separate jail buildings. Only 9 of them are operational. One of them is the original 1932 building, and that's closed. They use it for offices. But 9 of the buildings house prisoners. One of them, the Eric M. Taylor Center, sometimes referred to as C-76, is the replacement for the penitentiary and houses sentenced prisoners. But all of the other buildings, the Rose M. Singer Center for Women, the Davern Center for Adolescent Men, the Anna Cross Center, all house pretrial detainees, men and women who have been charged with crime but are awaiting trial. And the great shame in our city is that we have so many people housed because of the bail practices we employ. So many of them are held on prohibitive bails.
So important, right?
Yeah. And how long it takes. It takes twice as long to dispose of a criminal case today as it did in 1995. And if we merely got back to where we were in 1995, there would be several thousand fewer prisoners.
So, but going into the bail, majority of the people who have been arrested are poor people.
Exactly.
And the bail is set sometimes for very little.
Well, but
not
if you have nothing, $100 bail might as well be $1 million bail. I think the best example in recent memory is Jerome McDonough, the fellow who the press said baked to death on Rikers Island. And it was a terrible situation. Never should have been allowed to occur. Inexcusable failure on the part of the corrections staff to catch it, and the mental health staff, by the way. And I think they cannot be let off the hook on this. But this is a homeless veteran, a man who has served his country. He is found sleeping in the stairwell of a public housing project, charged with criminal trespass, a minor misdemeanor for which he could have gotten perhaps 30 days if he pleaded guilty at the most. And bail is set at $2,500, and he's mentally ill. What was the judge thinking when he set the bail at $2,500. This man couldn't even make $50 bail. And why was this man not diverted to a mental health court? Why didn't the defense attorney, whether it was legal aid or some other public defense organization, jump up and down and scream bloody murder and object to that bail level? What was the district attorney thinking when he asked for bail, or she asked for bail at that high a level? It's preposterous. Could we not have found a better way to manage Jerome McDonough?
So it's the whole system.
Yes.
It's from the very beginning right through.
And it's fragmented. No one entity, no one authority owns it. The city owns a piece of it. The state owns a piece of it. The district attorneys, who are sort of neither city nor state, own a piece of it. The courts, who are of the state but not subject to the governor, own a piece of it. Everybody owns, and then the legal defense bar owns a piece of it. And everybody sees the issue from their own narrow perspective, and there's no one in charge, no one entity in charge.
What's really interesting also, what you've talked about it, is the different services that they have for the prisoners, the health services, the education services. Those too are not connected to the Department
exactly.
of Corrections.
Years ago, the Department of Correction did a lousy job of providing health care. So in what was considered an improvement at the time, the responsibility for the delivery of health care was transferred to the then Department of Health, now the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, where it remains. And the provision of education was put in the hands of the then Board of Education, now the Department of Education. I can assure you, having spoken to Chancellor Klein when he was in charge, that in terms of the priorities that the Chancellor of the Department of Education in New York City has, the needs of the prisoners in the city's jails are very low. And having dealt with a person for whom I have enormous respect, Tom Frieden, when he was the Commissioner of Health and Mental Hygiene, I can tell you that as hard as he tried, his days were preoccupied with everything but the care of the prisoners on Rikers Island. And when there are problems, as in the McDonough case, we read about the jails, we read about the Department of Correction, we chastise the Commissioner of Correction, but we never ask the question, what was the level of mental health staffing when Jerome McDonough was in that cell? He was in a mental health unit. Where were the mental health professionals who should have been checking on his condition every day? Why were they not blowing the whistle and saying this man needs to be removed from his cell? So there's no accountability. It's fragmented. Everybody, and while they get together, and as you know from being in city government, everybody pretends to play nicely. When they leave the meetings, they get caught up by the other issues that challenge them.
Yeah. So the people on the island are basically, how many are there? A daily census about?
Probably the department is today holding probably around 10,000 prisoners. Probably 8,000 of them are on Rikers Island.
And a lot of them have to be transported from Rikers Island to the court. That's a whole other problem, isn't it?
I mean,
the slowness of the court proceedings.
It's a ballet that one has to observe to understand. To get the prisoners to the courts, especially the prisoners who are on trial, we have to get them from Rikers Island to 20 different courthouses in all 5 boroughs. And we have to do that in the midst of morning rush hour traffic. That means that the prisoners who are on trial and who have court appearances that day are awakened at 4 in the morning so that they can be fed, have an opportunity to dress and shower, and then there's a process that the corrections staff has to go through to identify each of them, make sure that we're moving the right person, and almost like the U.S. Postal Service delivering him to the right post office box, the right jail in the right borough. Is it Supreme Court? Is it criminal court? Is it family court? Where does he have to go? What floor is he going to? What court part is he going to? And then we have to search them, right, and load them on the buses. And if you get to Rikers Island between 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock, you will see a line of buses. When I was there, it was 30 to 50 buses every morning. They were lined up. And then at 7 o'clock in the morning, the oncoming, the bridge onto Rikers Island is a 2-lane bridge, one coming off, one going on. The oncoming traffic is shut down, and both lanes are open, and those buses leave the island at 7 a.m. promptly and weave their way through the city. And then, at the end of the day, those prisoners whose cases have not been dismissed or who have not been acquitted have to be returned and returned to the right building. And every 4 hours, there are buses coming from each of the arraignment courts throughout the city bringing new prisoners as they get arrested, and that's happening 24 hours a day, and that happens 5 days a week. So it's an amazing feat of management that the Corrections Department pulls off, and something like a traffic accident on the Grand Central Parkway. The President of the United States, or indeed the Vice President, landing at LaGuardia will shut down the bridge. The Secret Service would call us and say, you have to shut down the bridge. And the bridge will shut down until the President or Vice President has cleared the area. And if the Correction Officers Benevolent Association, for whatever reason, decides to hold a little demonstration, they hold it at the foot of the bridge, and the traffic backs up, and if you happen to live in East Elmhurst, Queens, you can't get to work that morning, and the buses can't get off the island, and the judges can't hear their cases.
It sounds like a Rube Goldberg cartoon.
It is. It is.
Incredible.
And if the jails were in each borough near the courthouse, I mean, think about it. The Brooklyn House of Detention was built literally across the street from the Brooklyn Criminal Court building where all arraignments are, and there's a tunnel underground that connects them, which is very good for public safety and very efficient. The Tombs is built adjacent to 100 Center Street, and there is a tunnel connecting the buildings. The Queens House of Detention, likewise, is built adjacent to the Queens Courthouse complex. The Bronx House was built close to the old Bronx courts when they were in the county building. They're on River Avenue, but even they were only a maybe 6-block ride from the court building.
So we know there are too many people in prison, right?
In jail.
In jail, I mean. I'm sorry. A jail as city, prison as state. Mentally ill people, we need to divert them to mental health facilities or treatment.
Yeah.
Who else shouldn't be there?
Well, who else?
Misdemeanor.
Well, as I say, I think that there are many people.
What percentage, I'm sorry, do we estimate to be mentally ill?
40%. I've heard 40%.
Yeah.
That's from the department. And that requires a discussion of its own. But to answer your question, I think if the city reformed its bail practices, if the city had a robust pretrial supervision program, 2,000 to 3,000 fewer prisoners would be on Rikers Island. On Christmas Day of 2014, just passed, the city held only 9,500 prisoners. That's the lowest number since 1983. That's remarkable. Mm-hmm. When I took over in 2003, we had 15,000 prisoners. So that's remarkable. It's a function of the reduction in crime and so on. But if the city reformed its bail practices and speeded up time to disposition, I think the city could get its jail population down below 7,000, which would give us a smaller jail population. We're already smaller than L.A. People used to say Rikers Island, New York was the largest jail system in the country. No longer true. That distinction belongs to Los Angeles. But if we got down to 7,000, we would be smaller than Chicago, smaller than Philadelphia, probably smaller than Miami, which is, I think, where New York should aim. The mentally ill, I think it is the great shame of our generation that in 2015, 40% of the prisoners in the city's jails are mentally ill. And this is true throughout the country, not just in New York City. It is a shame that more people receive acute mental health care in the city's jails than in the city's hospitals. In the 1980s, nationally, but in New York State, we went through a process of deinstitutionalization. We thought we could take people out of the back wards of those awful state hospitals, which indeed were awful, and satisfactorily manage their care in the community with a robust community-based mental health system. Unfortunately, that robust community mental health system never materialized, especially in poor neighborhoods and neighborhoods where people of color live. That was compounded by the fact that the premise was that because of psychotropic medications that had been developed, people's mental illness could be cared for through the administration of these medications. These medications have very, very strong and unpleasant side effects, and many mentally ill people who hear voices, people who are depressed, people who are anxious, choose to self-medicate. And so rather than taking the psychotropic medication, they take cocaine to ease their depression, or they take heroin to relieve their anxiety, or their hyperactivity, or their manic phase. And that happened at the very time that the country was engaged in a war on drugs. And guess what? We swept up a whole bunch of mentally ill people who were self-medicating. And as the war on drugs has eased, the people who are left behind, the most difficult, whose care we have to manage, are the mentally ill who self-medicate and who are not medication compliant. And the jails were never built architecturally to be therapeutic environments. The whole premise of a jail is that it houses a population that is capable of understanding and following direction, which many of the mentally ill can't. And it is staffed by people who never signed up to work with the mentally ill, who never chose to work with the mentally ill, but now find themselves ill-trained for this function. And it will take a lot of years to fix this. The mayor has put forward the beginnings of a plan. It's a sound plan as far as it goes, but it's only a beginning. And lest anyone think that it will be the silver bullet, it won't.
Do you think that the broken windows strategy is also increasing? I mean, if you get a warrant, if you get a misdemeanor and then you don't show up at court, then you've got a warrant out, then you're arrested. And you'll end up on Rikers Island, right?
Right. You know, it precedes broken windows. Before there was broken windows, somebody you and
something
I
else.
both know, a fellow by the name of Ben Ward,
Yeah.
came in, and he was the police commissioner. He had something called TNT. TNT was nothing more than stop and frisk. It was street sweeps, neighborhoods where there were high levels of drug crimes and drug sales. He sent in TNT teams, large numbers of police officers, kind of like Operation Impact, and they swept up lots of young black men who are found to be in possession of drugs on the street. So whether you call it TNT, whether you call it stop and frisk, whether you call it broken windows policing, this is policing strategy that has been engaged in New York City for well over 40 years. And if you engage in that strategy, well, of course, who are you going to pick up? You're going to pick up young black men standing on the street corner, openly smoking marijuana with an open bottle of beer. And unfortunately, you're also going to pick up people on probation and people on parole. I know from my days working in both probation and parole that whenever the police targeted a community or had these sweeps, the number of parolees and probationers who got swept up in it went up. And because these people were already engaged with the criminal justice system, they were confined and they couldn't get out. A parole arrest in New York, you can't get bailed on. If you're on probation and you get arrested again, you're subject to a hearing for a probation violation and you're going to sit in jail. So the problem builds on itself. And I used to say it's not as if the police commissioner would call the corrections commissioner and say, listen, I'm planning a sweep tonight, put out a few extra beds. That never happened. We'd wake up the next morning and find that there had been a surge in admissions and scratch our heads, and we wouldn't know why until we read the New York Post.
How much is it estimated that it costs to keep somebody there every day?
You know, that's a very complicated question. I love to answer it, but
it's got hidden costs, right?
Well, you know, the cost of a single prisoner is maybe $3 a day. You know, and if there's one less prisoner, you're not going to spend much less money. People talk about $165,000 a year because they take the total budget, which includes all those bus systems and the perimeter of Rikers Island and maintaining the court pens and everything that goes into running the city jail system, which is more than just housing prisoners.
And the staff and pensions
well,
and
yeah,
all that.
But and then they divide it by the average number of prisoners and they come up with this number. The fact is that unless you reduce the city's jail population
substantially
by a magnitude of at least 100 prisoners, you don't begin to save real money. If you reduce the city's population over the course of a year, if you reduce the ADP by 100 over the course of a year, you save about $1 million. If you divert a single prisoner, you don't save, as we say, bupkis.
So let's just summarize it because we're near the end. Break up Rikers Island. Well,
Absolutely.
first of all, reduce the
population, and that will allow you
Right.
to have fewer prisoners. And if you make use of the property that's already available for jails in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, you can cut the number of prisoners on Rikers probably in half.
And then you want accountability.
Absolutely.
So it's reorganizing the system, health, education.
Yes.
The irony of the education is that a lot of these people are in jail because of their lack of education in their lifetime.
So let's
failure of the
right.
education to fit.
Absolutely. There should be one entity that is responsible and that can be held accountable for all of it, and who cares about all of it. I felt that I cared more about the education of the prisoners than the chancellor, and I'm taking nothing away from Joel Klein.
Yeah.
But this just wasn't on his radar screen.
And training.
Training is critical. We train our correctional
Hiring
officers.
and training. We can see now that we've had trouble with the hiring.
Well, you know, it gets to
But
this. Correction officers are not held in the same
I
esteem
was
as
gonna say-
police and fire
yeah,
officers.
we come back to that.
That's right. They are denigrated in our community. They are looked down upon.
Right. That is why is that? There are
Oh,
less requirements to become a correction
In
officer?
fact, the requirements are identical.
Is that
The
interesting?
requirements to become a correction officer are identical to the requirements for a police officer. But we train them only half as long.
Mm-hmm.
We certainly don't honor them the way we honor police and firefighters, even though they're in daily contact with felons far more than any police officer ever will be.
So do you think we're ever going to be successful and reform this system?
I think this is a hopeful time. If the city of New York, if the New York Times, if this mayor and mayors to come sustain an interest and say that how we treat the least among us is the most important thing we do as a city, then I'm hopeful. If this is a one-year exercise, then we'll be here 40 years from now.
Well, we've come to the end of this program. Thank you, Martin Horn. But I hope you'll come back because I'm learning so much. And there is so much more to learn. We haven't talked about sentencing. We haven't talked about state. Well, so thank you.
Invite me. Okay.
I will. Thanks. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.